Program. Good morning, good afternoon, depending when you reach us. Thank you so much for joining us as we will be dedicating our program to Joan Phillips of blessed memory, Sora Yehudis Bas Avram, a wonderful friend, a member of Congregation Beis Shalom Chabad in Mineola. She passed away rather young, missed by all of her friends and her community. May her soul be a blessing to all of us. We're going to, this evening, discuss important dates of important people who passed away. The first, today, some 4,100 years ago, in the year 1656, Matriarch, the longest living human being of all time, passed away at the age of 969 years on this very day, the 11th day of Cheshvan, in the year 1656, which was 2105 before the Common Era. He passed away, the longest living human being, exactly 7 days before the beginning of the Great Flood. Matriarch was Adam's great-great-great-great-grandson and Noah's grandfather. The main focus this evening will be on the yahrzeit. Today, the 11th day of the Jewish month of Mar Cheshvan, is the yahrzeit, the passing, some 3,566 years ago, of Rachel. Rachel. She died giving birth to Benjamin in the year 1553 BCE. Rachel had previously given birth to Joseph, following years of being childless. She was married to Jacob. Jacob buried her by the roadside in Beis Lechem, where tradition says and teaches us that centuries later she wept and prayed for the Jewish people who were on the way into exile. Today, Rachel's tomb serves as a place of pilgrimage and prayer and is regarded as Judaism's third holiest site. This was by way of introduction. We're now going to go into depth on the significance of Rachel. The Rachel, one of our great matriarchs. So while we are blessed with 4 matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, Sarah, Rachel, Rebecca, and Leah, there's something very unique that the Jewish community throughout the world, throughout the eras, have always focused and celebrated, and of course recognized the passing specifically of Rachel. So please stay with us as we go through this in somewhat depth of the significance of our matriarch Rachel. The Jewish woman in general, the modesty, the unassumingness, the confidence, these are just some words to really express what we call Mama Rachel, the quintessential mother in the life of Mama Rachel, the mother of all Jews. Her life, Rachel's life, was one of hardship, yet she rose above it all. She was a true Jewish woman. We refer to her as Mama Rachel, our mother Rachel, because she's the mother of all of us. Young Rachel was raised by men of deceit. Her father Laban, learned his deceitful tricks from his father. He carried them out with great professional ease, cheating and fooling whoever came his way. Rachel's own mother passed away when she was but a small child. Somehow, Rachel managed to grow into a refined and charming woman. Rachel was so special that from the start, Jacob knew that she was his destined. The Torah goes at length to tell us about their first encounter. It was at a well where Rachel was attending her father's flock. But her beauty and dignity was unmistakable. And it didn't take long for Jacob's decision to want to marry her. There was only one obstacle: Laban himself, Rachel's devious father. The young couple feared, not illogically, that at the last possible moment, Laban, her father, would insist on Leah as the bride, arguing that it would bring lasting shame to our family to marry off Rachel, who was younger, before her older sister Leah. Here, we don't marry the younger before the older, is what they were concerned with. So what did Jacob and Rachel do? They devised a secret code between them. At the wedding, when Jacob would approach his veiled bride, she would give over these signs, and this would ensure that Rachel was the right sister. The wedding family arrived. The day arrived. True to form, Laban couldn't let things go as planned. He made all the elaborate preparations for the wedding. For whom? Not for Rachel, but for Leah as the bride. And Rachel, the younger sister, learned of the change, learned of her father's plans. And her concern was not for herself. She tossed aside all hopes and dreams, her plans for her marriage, her commitment to her betrothed to Jacob. And what did she think? What will be of my sister? Jacob will approach Leah, ask for the secret signs, and Leah won't know what he's referring to. And she said to herself, Rachel, I'll be saved. Leah won't be married to my groom. But think of the shame, the disgrace that Leah will feel, the embarrassment in front of the entire town, not to mention on Twitter and Facebook. So in a selfless act of love, what did Rachel do? She taught her sister the private signals that she and her betrothed, Jacob, had arranged, which was there to finalize their destiny. Jacob, of course, eventually discovered the deception. Sometime later, after the wedding, an identical one, there was a second wedding. Only this time, finally Rachel was the bride. But for the rest of her life, Rachel would not be her husband's only wife. As great as this act of sacrifice was, Rachel would perform yet another one, a greater one. Years later, Rachel gave birth to a second son. It was a difficult childbirth, one that Rachel sacrificed her life for. Our matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, and even Eve, Chava, were buried in a very hallowed cave in the hills of Hebron, known as the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. They are all buried alongside their husbands, Abraham with Sarah, Isaac with Rebecca, and Adam and Eve. And eventually Jacob and Leah would also be laid to rest in this holy spot. But Rachel, who was Jacob's first, intention to be married to her, would have loved to lay beside Jacob in this holiest spot, for all. Surely, as Jacob's primary and most beloved wife, it surely was within her rights to be buried beside her husband in place of Leah. What happened? Leah, the ultimate Jewish mother that we're discussing, gave up this privilege. For what, my friends? And when you hear this, you'll know why we remember her specifically. She gave up this privilege of being buried next to her husband, Jacob, for the future of her children. Rachel, a righteous and holy woman, had the ability to foresee events in the future. And what did she see? In front of her, she saw a vision of her children, the Jewish people, some 1,200 years ahead. At that time, the Jewish people would be living in the Holy Land, Israel. But alas, she also saw they would make mistakes. They would sin and sin. And sin again, compelling God to punish them. And as we know, what does our history tell us? God would destroy the magnificent temple and banish his people into exile. This was the time of the first temple. Rachel saw all of this. She also saw the route that her children would take on the way out into exile, into the Babylonian exile. And in her mind's eye, she saw hundreds of thousands of Jews shackled and broken in spirit, being led to the Babylonian country, led by the general Nebuzaradan back to his homeland. And there he'd be able to show off the success of his battles. This is the sad procession that Rachel saw. And she saw this procession that would lead directly past the road where she lay, where she was buried, on her final moments on earth. What did Rachel say? What did she think? If I'm buried here, my children will be able to stop at my grave and pray to the Holy One. Maybe in my merit, he will answer their heartfelt prayers. And so, for the sake of her great-great-grandchildren, many years in the future, and she saw that they would sin and they would now be exiled. Rachel, therefore, asked not to be buried in the cave of Machpelah with her husband Jacob and all the illustrious ancestors who were there, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and her sister Leah and Jacob. No, she gave all of that up to be buried in Bethlehem, all alone, where would she be able to help her children. And guess what? Her husband Jacob heeded to her request, and Jacob was buried at the side of the road, and a monument was set up marking the spot for posterity. Hashem, God, saw Rachel's selfless sacrifice. This epitomizes the quality found in all women. What is that? She focused only on her children. Standing in the background, she let others get the honor and the credit while doing what was required. God watched proudly and took note. And years later, Rachel's prophecy came to pass. The Jewish people indeed succumbed to their evil inclinations. They worshipped idols, ignored the pleas of the prophets, and Hashem indeed sent the Babylonians to destroy the temple and bring the Jews back with them to Babylonia. And just as she had foreseen, the broken, desperate Jews crowded around Rachel's grave and cried their hearts out. This is what happened. Now, in heaven, there was a huge tumult when they came and prayed at her graveside. Why? Our holy ancestors were pleading before God to save the Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon. Yet Hashem remained silent. He turned a deaf ear to their pleas. Suddenly, amidst all of the noise, there was one voice, a wail that pierced through the heavens. It was Mama Rachel. It was Rachel. Hearing her children's cries, began weeping bitterly, sadly for her children. She was inconsolable. Her children were in pain. Yes, they'd made mistakes. Yes, they even deserved what was coming to them. But they were her children. Rachel, the epitome of a Jewish mother, could not relax until her children were helped. And God, who ignored the request of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Hashem, who didn't listen to Sarah, Rebekah, and Leah, when he heard Rachel's pleas, could no longer remain hard-hearted. Enough! He lovingly ordered Mama Rachel, dry your tears. You requested not to be buried in Hebron, where you'll be able to lay in peace and holiness for all times. And since you gave up your rightful place in the cave of Machpelah in order to help your children, I too will relinquish my honor and help them too. Your children will not remain exiled forever. They will eventually return to the land. The famous words, V'shavu banim legvulam. And with these words, God altered his holy plan, rescinding his initial decree. And then suddenly, stillness reigned in the heaven once again. Mama Rachel, whose yahrzeit is today that we're discussing, our ever-loving mother, could now relax. Her children were being looked after by Mama Rachel. She gave birth to only 2 of the 12 tribes, Joseph and Benjamin. Yet in our eyes, she is the mother of all the Jewish people. Mama Rachel, our loving mother, still lays buried near Beis Lechem today. Today, her grave is included in the city proper, yet it is far away from the grave of her husband, Jacob. And today, especially today, Jews come to pour out their hearts to our dedicated mother. Because even today, even at this moment, Mama Rachel is listening and always pleading before God on our behalf. You know, this feature, to do what is necessary for the sake of one's children, this is a mark of a Jewish mother. She may stand in the sidelines, yet she remains the true hero. She has no need for public displays of honor. It is for this reason that a mother passes down the Jewish heritage. If a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman, his children will not be Jewish. But if the opposite occurs, if a person has a Jewish mother, no matter the lineage of his father, he is Jewish. Why? Because a mother gives life to a child, to his essence. And the title Jew is the description of essence. May Mama Rachel, continue to cry for us, to plead our case before the Holy One in heaven. And may we be redeemed once more, but this time for eternity, so that we can be reunited with our mother, Mama Rachel, forever. And so, dear friends, this is the story of Rachel, our mother, who passed away at the young age of 36. And that is why it's one of the most moving accounts that we will ever read in the Torah. One that continues to nourish us till this very day. There's another aspect that we read that gives us even a deeper aspect to our learning this evening. I just want to pause for a moment to recognize the many people who are watching us. Please like us on Facebook, send it out to your Twitter list, and if you'd like to send us a note, I know that at this very moment, my good friend Jason Guberman, recently married, Mazel Tov, is joining us. If you have any comments, please, you can post them, and I will pause to recognize. But again, I appreciate everyone's coming to us and joining us for this weekly webcast. So I now continue to go a little deeper now into this amazing Mama Rachel, the mother of the Jewish people, whose yahrzeit is this very day, the 11th day of the Jewish month of Mar Cheshvan, 3,566 years ago. I now bring you back a little bit to when first Rachel and Jacob met. As we mentioned earlier on, they met at a well. And when the Torah tells us, when Jacob sees Rachel, he cries and she cries. Allow me a few moments now to discuss the significance of this sadness all the way back in the beginning of their encounter. We're not talking about after they had to give over the signs for the marriage or other aspects of her life, all the way in the beginning. When Rachel, the shepherdess, appears with her father's sheep, the Torah tells us Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and he wept. Why did he weep? Why did he weep? And Rashi tells us because he foresaw that Rachel would not be buried at his side. It's already foresawn that this would. And as I explained, why would that be? So she could cry and plead for her suffering children. In other words, all the way in the beginning, when he set his eyes on Rachel for the very first time, Jacob wept for all the tears that Rachel would shed for her children. And our question is, every detail in Torah is both precise and relevant to our lives. What's the deepest significance of all these tears, both of Rachel's and Jacob's? Now, on the practical sense, on the surface, we have to understand there was a sadness. He would not have his wife buried near him. But what's so significant of it being on the road? At the end of the day, you could ask a simple question. Surely her exiled children would be consoled by passing by her grave on the way out of Jerusalem. But why are Rachel's tears more effective in her grave on the road rather than weeping from the family ancestral burial place, Machpelah? I mean, if she was so unique and she was cared for her children, as indeed she did, why was it so important that she was crying and she was to be buried on the road? I mean, is it just simply a geographical thing to be able to physically be at the gravesite? I mean, if she was obviously concerned for her children, she could be crying from anywhere. And more importantly as well, how does it help us today, right now, to know that Rachel lies buried on the road and weeps for her children? And that Jacob kept thinking about this all the way in the beginning on their first encounter. What I share with you can be found in the book of Tanya in chapter 45, where the first Chabad Rebbe presents a very powerful meditation on achieving a spiritual awareness in life. It helps explain to us this very deep relationship, this psycho-spiritual dimension of what Rachel and Jacob really are all about on a more metaphysical level. Rachel is the supernal attribute of Malchus. She is the individual who carries the flag of dignity. She is the source of all souls. A mother, the source of her child. A matriarch, the source of all souls. Jacob, on the other hand, on a deeper sense, is the dimension of Tiferes, compassion. And there's something very unique about these two husband and wives that has a cosmic effect on all of us. While Jacob represents the level of empathy, his dear wife Rachel represents the soul, the neshama, that has to go through a very traumatic descent into this material world. A husband and wife are like a body and a soul. And every soul on earth, ever born, the Tanya explains, begins its journey in the spiritual realms, and ultimately, you and me and all of us have been thrown into an exile, into a physical body, into a universe that conceals the soul's presence and all of its great powers of spirituality that every one of our souls has. So the divine spark of the soul, in effect, is trapped in the narrow confines of this mundane existence that we're all in. Even if one never transgresses, we find ourselves existentially in a disconnect, our old souls. How much more so is the spiritual exile we all find ourselves in if the person gets enmeshed in very narcissistic behavior, unrefined thoughts, speech, or deeds, which of course further displaces the divine soul. So in simple words, we all have a soul that's come into this world. This soul on a spiritual level is Rachel. She manifests and identifies with that spiritual exile of coming from such greatness and being pushed into this world. And that was reflected in her life of how low, so to speak, she had to find herself. She pays with her life when she passes away in childbirth. Can you imagine? How low can you get? How sad can you get? And furthermore, she ends up dwelling in a lonely wayside grave. For what reason? In order to bear witness to the suffering of her children. That's another sadness. So as long as her children are wandering and oppressed, Rachel, the soul, cannot find any final rest, and she remains with them on the road, in the exile. Rachel weeps for her children and refuses to be comforted, as we've been discussing. So what is Jacob's role in this process? What's the interaction between Jacob and Rachel? And the Tanya goes on to explain that this soul, as in this metaphor of Rachel's soul, has a part that cries for it, has empathy. That's the Jacob side. That represents compassion. This is a very potent method to awaken the exiled soul, to wake us up in this world from our feeling of displacement, empowering Rachel to stand strong with her exiled children. And as Hashem promised that her tears would prevail, and God says, your work will be rewarded, and they will return from the land of the enemy. Hashem told her, there's hope for your future. V'shavu banim legvulam. Your children will return to their borders. So the interaction of Jacob and Rachel are really the soul in this world. Let me put it into psychological terms. Rachel represents dignity. What is dignity? What's that side of us? That feeling of confidence and security that comes from knowing that we have an inherent value. We're indispensable. We have that pintaliyid inside of us by the very fact that we were created in the divine image. That's the neshama. That's the soul. The antithesis of that kind of feeling of dignity is the sense of worthlessness, or shame, or insecurity, or a low self-esteem, sometimes to the point of self-loathing. What is a mother? A nurturing mother instills in a child a feeling of malchus, a feeling of dignity. More accurately, she doesn't instill it. A healthy mother cultivates it and nourishes that dignity that's really is the birthright of every one of us, of every soul. When there's a lack of nurturing, dignity is not annihilated. It just goes undercover. In our materialistic world where our souls find ourselves, and as we're explaining, just as Rachel's soul came and faced so many challenges, our own souls feel the same pain and the same distancing. And sadly, in this world, we get distracted by temporary pleasures and forget that single most important responsibility, and that is the nurturing of our children's majesty. And that is something, the message, the life of dear Rachel is so important to us more than ever today. You know, with our ever-accelerating technologies and comforts, and the unprecedented standard of living, ironically and paradoxically, think about this, our level of self-esteem continues to erode. The busier we are with our outer stimulations and acquiring all kinds of wealth, sadly, the more we neglect our responsibilities and sometimes even our own children. The more functional our external lives, the less functional our inner lives. So of all the attributes, perhaps one of the most severely compromised in our world is our self-worthiness, our dignity. A person can have much wisdom, understanding, knowledge, love, discipline, compassion, ambition, even humility and bonding. But personal dignity is displaced in this world, in our dysfunctional society. And here's the good news. There enters Rachel. Rachel, the quintessential mother of Israel, resides on the road, right with us, and always remains there through our wandering, through our confusion. It wasn't that her prayers wouldn't help if she was a Morris and Machpelah with a husband and the rest of the great ancestors. Her whole life, from the moment she was born, from her encounter with her future husband, what happened on the night of the wedding, and what happened later on, through and through her life, all the way down to her sad passing, and where she was born, and where she was buried, was all part of a reflection of our own wandering, our own confusion. Deep down, dear Rachel is watching over us, protecting us and nurturing us. We all have this very special mother, healthy mother, Rachel. We must always remember to live a life of meaning, even though we may find ourselves in exile. And even if we do not recognize this, we're not being deprived. Rachel's there. She's always standing vigil, adoring us unconditionally, then and now, to this very moment. How does a person wake up that soul? To this very day, Rachel continues to weep for her children. As the mother of all children, she watches over us and weeps with us and for us. She sheds a tear for every lonely child, for every suffering youngster or adult. And these are not just mere tears. These are the tears of a loving mother. And all of us must know that regardless of our own biological mother's efforts on our behalf, regardless of the way our dignity is nourished or abused, our dear Mama Rachel remains on watch and does not rest. And when trouble brews, she intercedes on our behalf. We can only wonder whether it was Rachel's tears that have kept us alive for all these years, allowing us to survive despite all the odds. I'm sure it has been that way. Now the question is, can we activate? Is there a way of waking up, deepening that side of ourselves, that Rachel's maternal love that we all have within ourselves? You know, that we shouldn't have feelings of depression or self-pity, but to have that feeling of dignity. You know how we do that? With our bissel hopra rachmanis, to evoke compassion. Have some mercy. Hab rachmanis av sich. Have some mercy on oneself. Let us recognize the beautiful soul that we all have, a very lofty, delicate creature. Where is it? Think about it. Where is our soul? It's now trapped in our body, and in a more general sense, in our heartless world. What's the soul waiting for? Waiting for us to acknowledge her, to be embraced, to be kissed, to be cried for, with her, to commit ourselves in activities that caresses our soul, in thought, in speech, in action, and to allow our souls to realize its potential in this world. Hok Rahmanas. Where does that Rahmanas come from? This compassion on oneself and on others helps our mother Rachel within ourselves to do her work. Until we arrive at our destination, when our work will be rewarded and we will return from the land, as we know, there's hope for our future and our children will return to their borders. We're on the job. So on this day, we recognize Jacob, her dear husband, personified compassion. He cried for her as she eventually would cry for all of us. His crying, that was the compassion, the Rahmanas, when he looked at his dear wife and what she would mean to him and to all of us. So today, on the 11th day of Cheshvan, the anniversary of Rachel's passing, we commemorate and do our best to learn from the intense compassion that she had, that a human being can express towards another. A compassion that allows for a development of a true, objective perspective on our life. And that is by seeing the positive sparks of holiness in humanity and in this world. A compassion that does not question, anything, but rather emulates God's boundless mercy. And when we reflect and live that way, God responds in kind. He showers us with compassion and the ultimate redemption. And this, my friends, is the importance of this day, of recognizing the most important aspect of our life. This is your host, Rabbi Pearl. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, and have a good night, and wishing you all the best.